We're live. I had a little bit of a pause there before I announced that we're live. We are joined by the Oracle of London, based in London, Alexander Mercouris, and we are joined by the one, the only, the great Mr. Robert Barnes. Robert, where can people find you real quick?
At vivabarneslaw.locals.com. That's where they can find anything and everything, participate and partake in the community. It's right up there with the Duran.locals.com is the best place to have interesting, fun, engaging conversations.
Best place on locals. It has exclusive content, and Robert does all kinds of great shows, including the Hush Hush show, which is you learn all kinds of very interesting things in those Hush Hush episodes that you do, Robert. Very interesting.
Very interesting.
Yeah, well, it turned out predictive in ways that helped influence aspects of where the American debate went, as chances have it. So it's been it turned out a lot more predictive than as you gentlemen's commentary has been much more predictive than all the so-called experts we have here in the West.
And we'll discuss a lot of those predictions, Robert. And one of your predictions, before I forget, I remember the last live that we did. You said, I thought there was going to be a Biden conflict in Africa, but it just didn't happen. And about a week and a half later, Somalia. So that kind of came true.
Africa always made more sense from the perspective. It's the Democratic pitch that one, that Rwanda is considered the great failure of the Clinton administration, not intervening and not getting involved and everything that happened. So especially within the kind of neoliberal mythology, that was the great failure of non-interventionism. And then secondly, it's a place nobody really cares about. So a lot of crazy stuff can happen. I mean, Lavrov made a joke out of it. He's like, if you're really worried about the Russia-Ukraine war, just imagine it's the Middle East, or imagine it's Africa, and you'll be able to sleep just fine. Your Lavrov commentary. But it made more practical for the deep state wants someplace they can, have their little grab bag of fun and their little money bag, because that's what the Ukraine bill really is. I mean, it's called the Ukraine bill. It's a deep state power grab and deep state money grab, black bag operation. And it's just a deep state budget. That's why almost none of it will probably end up in Ukraine with ordinary Ukrainians. That's for sure.
Yeah.
But I mean, you look at that $40 billion, you dig in, you're just like, how much are we actually spending on arms or soldiers that will actually go to the Donbass, the front lines of the conflict? It's actually pretty small out of that $40 billion.
Yeah.
Over half of it.
I heard about $6 billion out of it.
That may end up on the high side. Because what they did is they split it. 20 billion is basically for the State Department, and it's for the State Department to have fun with. Your NGOs, your favored media people. That's why I say it's really a deep, we've had these before, deep state budgets, and we called it Vietnam, or we labeled it Afghanistan, or we labeled it Iraq, and now we label it Ukraine. But you look at where the actual money goes, and there's almost no direct monetary transfer to the Ukrainian government, almost no direct guaranteed actual arms. Hey, we're going to ship this from here to here to here on this date. Now there's up to $6 billion in new defense arms that may be sent. The rest of it's basically to replenish what's already been sent over, and that's basically for it. Really, when you dig into it, it's just a big deep state budget. Half of the Pentagon, half of the State Department. So the Pentagon figures out, okay, well, we'll help these defense contractors and these buddies here and this group's over here, and we'll decide how much we spend over there. Some of our trainers, I guess they're going to send a special ops unit into Kiev for, to secure the embassy. I don't know if they're really going to try, Iran 1979 all over again, but whatever. And then on the State Department side is where, 20 billion. That's a nice little chunk of change for all the little NGOs, political organizations, press organizations. But and as you noted, Alexander, part of it is to actually have Ukrainian government officials depend on that budget for their own paychecks.
Yeah.
So it's like a de facto colony. I mean, in terms of its operation, it's if you're anywhere in the Zelensky regime hierarchy and you want to get paid, you want to eat next week, you better be doing the U.S. State Department's bidding, because that's the only place where your paycheck is coming from. So but as we predicted, actually, it was even more than I thought it was going to be. We went from 6 Republican House members saying not interested to almost 60. We went from 0 Republican senators saying they were going to do something to 11 opposing it. And there were some big names in that group. There were some leadership people in the House, or people that want to become leaders in the House, who voted no. In the Senate, the big switch was Josh Hawley. So Hawley started out on this thing. Hawley has national ambitions. He thinks he's going to be president at some point, at least attorney general, some other things like that. And so he started off when this whole Ukraine thing did, calling up Zelensky and saying what a hero he was and all this lame crap. And he got blowback from some of his populist base. Nothing is a better signifier of what's happened in terms of the populist Republican base than Josh Hawley. He goes from being a big cheerleader for Zelensky in Ukraine to voting no on 40 billion, even though Mitch McConnell was going nuts about anybody voting no. And the whole deep state apparatus was bringing massive pressure on. And Alexander, the piece you mentioned earlier or emailed over about Axios, what's translating is Axios, for those that don't know, has a piece out identifying how much within Washington this anti-entanglement, anti-intervention, non-real, whether you call it neocon, neoliberal, globalist, whatever label you want to put on it, this pro-intervention mindset is being countered not only amongst the populist base in the country, showing up in more House members and Senate members opposing even money being sent over. And again, this wasn't money really being sent over. It's mostly going to be spent here, but cycled and defined as being spent for them, of course, is these think tanks. Is what's happening is you've got the libertarian wing and the populist wing. The libertarian wing has more think tank control and donor influence. The populist wing has more voter influence. But between Donald Trump, as Noam Chomsky said, being the only reasonable voice on the Ukraine issue out of the West, and you have Donald Trump Jr., who made very aggressive populist anti-entanglement intervention war speeches regarding Ukraine when he was in campaigning for J.D. Vance in Ohio. And but you add that to Peter Thiel, you add that to the Koch brothers, who have some libertarian leanings sporadically on issues of foreign policy. And you add that to some big names switching because there's been a donor switch, which is increasingly even think tanks in D.C. rely on crowdfunding, mass funding, not just big checks from big players. So like the Heritage Foundation is talking about taking a realpolitik position on war, which is against this. Mearsheimer, others. There was the debate, which had that dimwit from the Obama administration. It was actually an ambassador to Russia, say stupid stuff again, but that's another story. But what you're seeing is your article, I think, is absolutely right. You're seeing organized Washington, think tanks, staffers, political action committees, press organizations get in on supporting and institutionalizing this populist voter base that is growing louder and louder here in the States by the day, especially when we had to get foreign aid. I mean, America had to get foreign aid to feed babies. It's insane. We had, while we're, at least on paper, sending money to Ukraine, and gotta ask Europe, please send us baby formula so the babies don't starve. Not a great situation for the Biden administration right now. But if you are part of the populist right, wanting to see that grow in the anti-war, anti-intervention space, you're seeing it grow at almost record pace since the beginning of this conflict.
Robert,
before you start, Alexander, let me just say one quick hello to everybody on Odyssey, Rumble, Locals, our great locals community, YouTube. Let's just get right into it, guys. The super chats, any chats and messages that you guys send, we will put them all together at the end of the show, and we will answer everything in a dedicated show. Do not worry, we're going to answer, as we always do, all of the questions, and any questions addressed to Robert, we will get Robert. We will chase him down and hunt him down to answer those questions. Alexander, over to you. Oh, Zariel, Alan Watson, our moderators, whoever else is moderating, thank you very, very much for everything that you do. Alexander, over to you.
I just wanted to say that, Robert, you are far ahead of the curve on that one, that there would be this revolt within Congress. I can remember you saying this would happen in our previous live stream. I don't think anybody expected it. In Britain, it's come as an absolute shock. And I would add that today, I was reading in the Daily Telegraph, we have one good journalist on the Daily Telegraph, who's Ambrose Evans Pritchard. I say one good journalist. more perhaps correct to say an interesting journalist, an intelligent journalist. He's sometimes completely wrong on some things. But anyway, he's in Davos at the moment, where the World Economic Forum is happening. And he says that the people from Congress are split, that there are people from Congress, and he was careful not to say which party, but some of them are now saying that this has gone too far. And he quoted somebody called Tim Cantor, who you probably know who he is, I don't, but Tim Cantor saying that the United States is in danger of overplaying its hand. And he also quoted somebody else called Senator Christopher Combs, who apparently is also now saying that things are not going as planned. So, Robert, I don't know who these people, Cantor and Combs, are, not being the great expert on US politics. But the fact is that it's been picked up in Britain that this shift is taking place in the US. That article in the New York Times, that editorial in the New Times, rang alarm bells here. We're very, very attuned to what is going on in Washington. Here in Britain, you must understand that the political class, all of them, read the New York Times. I mean, it's absolutely indispensable that they all know what the mood, how the wind is blowing in Washington, because we are so close in some ways, in Britain especially, to the US. And of course, we have the same language, so it's easy for us to communicate. But already you can see that in Britain, this is being picked up. People are noticing that this is happening. And if the congressional people at Davos are taking different views, well, you can be sure that this is spreading all over Davos, and and all the talks and discussions, and the cafes, the restaurants, the bars around Davos, where the World Economic Forum is taking place. They're all going to be talking about it to each other. They're going to say, America is moving, and it's not moving in the direction the Biden administration wants it to go. So, and that's now going to be relayed right across Europe. The British, as I said, picked up the New York Times article. In Davos, the continental Europeans, the Germans, the Austrians, the Italians, the French, they will all be picking it up as well.
Yeah, I think there's somebody in Davos didn't want some of those cafe conversations overheard, because they sent the local police to try to harass little Jack Posobiec, who is there covering it. And apparently, I guess the Swiss, if you're assigned to the World Economic Forum, you get your own special World Economic Forum police badge. And it doesn't look like it's not as good as a Duran symbol. Let's just put it that way. It looks more like something out of a the alternative religions. Let's call it that way. Maybe appropriate for the for the Davos crowd. But yes, you're absolutely correct. There is a split within the American deep state about the progress of the war, and some of this we've discussed before, and that there was clearly, as to Russia, some members of the deep state apparatus in the United States, most likely within the Pentagon, that were not gung-ho about escalating conflict with Russia from the get-go. That may have been part of the reason for that Biden conference with Putin all the way back, whether it was concern about Russian weapons, whether it was concern that this is a distraction from China, which is what some of them are focused on, whether some are just, enough realpolitik that they may share the agenda of isolating Russia, undermining Putin, but just don't think that's a achievable objective or worth the effort. But I think what's accelerated it is there is a great fear that that this will fail, and that this will fail badly. And so what's accelerating this divide within the deep state is those members who say, this isn't going to work out the way we want. Given that, we need to find an exit ramp now, not have a complete disaster, as embarrassing as Afghanistan was just a year ago, not as embarrassing as Vietnam turned out to be, not as embarrassing as Iraq turned out to be, not as embarrassing as Libya or Syria, or, you could argue, throw in Sudan, Somalia, Black Hawk Down, all that turned out to be. But this would be particularly embarrassing because so much was put into it, and so it was so heavy in terms of the media apparatus, in terms of the amount of money spent on it, or at least on paper sent on it. And so the first signs of cracks, public cracks, was the New York Times editorial. But that was basically saying time to look at an exit ramp in its own way. And then the second aspect, it does tell you something about where Ukraine stands, that everybody assumes Zelensky will do whatever we tell him to do. That nobody thinks Ukraine or Zelensky is acting independently. Now, I mean, whether it was the British, whoever leaked it, that Boris's special trip there was to shut down the Istanbul agreements and accords from moving forward. But it's quite extraordinary, the assumptions made. But the deep state divide is real. It started out with the New York Times editorial, then it transitioned over to Kissinger's comments in Davos, and Kissinger's always been part of that deep state apparatus, but the more realistic, you could say. What I used to say about Kissinger is his moral compass is, I don't trust his moral compass at all, but his intellectual capabilities are not meaningfully endowed. Whereas this new generation of deep state, national security state, whatever label you want to put on it, I do have great and grave doubts about their competence. I mean, we'll discuss later the Sussman trial taking place in Washington, where the head of the United States FBI counterintelligence couldn't even tell people what his last title was. Had basic failures that people watching are like, oh my God, this guy is head of U.S. counterintelligence? No wonder Aldrich Ames had so much fun for so many years. But I mean, it's that level of ungovernable almost incompetence. But that's where the split is. The Victoria Newlands, the Kagan family, that whole crew, still gung-ho. The people that are kind of the junior varsity team, Obama's junior varsity team is what's in charge now. You got Dimwit making jokes at the Georgetown commencement proceedings, Blinken. I mean, these guys can't even help themselves. I mean, they're so out of touch with the world. They're almost like Mark Zuckerberg style looking robots when they communicate in public. You had Biden, who they can't keep on a leash because he goes off and says, yeah, we'll invade Taiwan. American military will be there right away if you get around. And then they'd say, no, we didn't really quite mean that. They had to try to walk that back as quickly as possible. So in that, when you have that context going on, I think you have a real deep divide. And Kissinger really just confirmed it in Davos. For him to go to Davos after the New York Times piece and say, we probably should be looking at this a little bit differently. Probably time, because they want to exit gracefully before they get publicly embarrassed, because it could be any time now, as you mentioned before, how the battleground is going to go in a war of attrition, that things just happen suddenly. They go slow, and then sudden. It's like a cliff. Well, we've seen that over the last week. I mean, we've seen all of a sudden, nothing happens for like a week, and then in a day, 5 villages fall. And that they're clearly going to lose more and more land. And then you get this confirmed. The only time you ever see this confirmed in the West is when one of these mercenaries come back, with one of these volunteers come back. And they're like, this was not fun. This was not Game of Duty at all. This was sitting there watching my buddy blown up, next buddy blown up, trying to dodge. It was like, I'm out of here. So those kind of stories give you a sense of what's happening to the Ukrainian on the front line. So the fear is, what happens if the Ukraine collapsed militarily in the East in days or weeks? That, the more Russia achieves what it wants militarily, the less willing it's going to be to negotiate diplomatically. And how embarrassing would it be for these kind of things to go? And I think there are also not only legitimate divisions within Europe, but I think the apparatus that wants an exit ramp is encouraging people like the Italians. Because all of a sudden the Italians started all talking at once. And it was like, you wonder whether they got a green light from somebody somewhere to go ahead. But, all of a sudden everybody was saying, hey, maybe we should look at getting out of this. Maybe Berlusconi was talking, everybody was talking. And they put forward a very reasonable settlement proposal. So I think and then of course the Germans and the Austrians are nervous about the economic impact. But it's definitely, we have a definite deep state divide with people like Coons. I mean, Coons is an old school establishment senator. Very close and very tight with Biden. He would be representing the fact that he's saying anything at all that's the word that things are not means that there's a part of the deep state or the part of the interventionist apparatus that doesn't want this to continue on the path it's going. And they think the only exit is not the exit that apparently the Poles are thinking about, bringing back all Polish-Lithuanian part of Ukraine. They're like, let's just pretend that all you Poles are now Ukrainians. Apparently, they're going to be able to vote and run office.
I know.
And it looks like a map. Like, I think there's two exit maps. One exit is whatever could get done right now. And the later exit map, not only is it an embarrassing deep state disaster for U.S. foreign policy, because all these military strategic intel experts are going to be embarrassingly wrong for the whole world to witness. Everything the State Department said, everything that was both externally and to some degree internally has been communicated. All these people are going to be embarrassed and humiliated if this goes the way it's going currently. If they have a current exit ramp, everybody saves face. And the people who want to reshift to China and focus on other things, they win too, because they just don't see this as a big battle. But that split is a real split, and you're seeing it, and you're probably going to see more and more of it. You'll see another House member here, somebody that's a surprising source, say, well, maybe we should maybe we should look at that because of this, because otherwise, I mean, I was looking at an old, there's a YouTube video that does Ukraine all the way from beginning of time, basically, as to what their ethnic makeup was and who governed different parts of the country. And if you just stopped somewhere in the middle of the 16th century, you could find a part where the almost everything other than what was Lenin gave Ukraine in 1922. So if you take Kharkiv down to Odessa and you carve that out and you gave it to Russia, and the rest you gave to Poland, there's actually maps that look that way for Ukraine in the 15th and 16th century. There were the Polish-Lithuanians had that part, and either the Russians or the Ottoman Turks had the others. And it's and to see the Poles talk about it so openly, and we're going to recreate colonization by recreating the Polish-Lithuanian Empire by letting Poles hold office in Ukraine. They can just show up and run and hold office. And there's going to be no borders. I'm curious how that's going to work, but I think for those people who don't necessarily want that outcome, they want something more manageable that's more face saving. They know they got to act now because they're on the clock. They got probably 30 days to get something like that done before Donbass falls. I mean, it may take longer, but it's looking like that 90-day thereabout timetable. Russia is going to be pretty close to securing all the Donbass plus all of the southern region already that they already have. And then from there, what's going to stop Russia from keep going? I don't think they go to Kiev. I never agreed with that analysis. But I do think they probably go towards Odessa because then they take the rest of the sea. They take what's historically, especially, I mean, Putin kind of gave this away when he said, I'm going to decommunize your borders for you. Decommunizing the borders would be that 1922 and 1954 Crimea and southeastern Ukraine. And that again goes back. That was almost never part of the Polish Empire. Poland never went that far into Ukraine. I mean, you had Cossacks who governed there. You had Tatars who governed there. You had Mongols and governed there. You had the Ottoman Turks who governed there. And then, of course, you had the Russians who governed there. Briefly the Nazis for a year or two. But not the rest of that, especially now far western Ukraine. It's a whole different animal. But it looks like Poland's solution is a split Ukraine that basically expands Poland into the rest of there, and then Russia takes the rest. That the Kissinger wing of the deep state probably is not happy with that idea. They would rather Ukraine still exist, still be a player, still be something they can play with from the West that doesn't go through Poland to control or influence. And save face vis-a-vis Russia. Especially, I mean, right now the problem is if the goal was to make an example of Russia, of globalist financial monopoly, being able to assert political, social, cultural, military control through that's already lost. But right now, if you got out, let's say within the next 30 days, maybe you could say, oh, it was in a transition phase. It still would have worked in a month or 2 or 3 months or whatever. The longer this goes on, that Russia holds out and that the ruble grows rather than drops, and their internal economic stability, back to our discussion, the 1997 Putin thesis is proven true, the more trouble for the globalists. So I think the smart globalists, the smart deep state operators want an exit ramp now before they're forced on an exit ramp that embarrasses everybody.
I completely agree, and that is logical. That is exactly what they should do. And the point to say is 30 days. Perhaps I would guess that's about the right time. I mean, it's probably going to take less time for the Russians to clear northern Donbass. If northern Donbass collapses, the rest of Donbass follows it because it becomes untenable. And then you can already start to see things begin to move very fast in other places as well. And on the question of the economy, well, the ruble is now at 56 to the dollar. You know, it hit 150 at one point. It's now at 56. So it's continuing to strengthen almost every day. And the sanctions, the sixth package of sanctions that the European Union was planning for, that seems to be at a standstill. Now, coming to Poland, if Poland gets itself involved, if it gets involved in Ukraine, if it starts taking over Western Ukraine, if it starts trying to recreate the Commonwealth, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Geopolitical, I'm going to tell you that a lot of people in Europe are not going to be happy. I suspect a lot of people in Germany are not going to be happy. It won't just be the realists in the deep state in the United States who are not going to be happy with it. I think you'll find lots of people in Germany who already find the Poles difficult to work with. That's putting it mildly. I think that a enlarged Poland getting itself sucked into Ukraine, getting itself into all kinds of historic issues with Russia is going to be a very, very concerning for some people of a realist school in Germany. And that may be why the Green ministers, the Habeck and Baerbock, are now starting to sound extremely shrill. Robert Habeck, who's Germany's unbelievable, I mean, I find him the most incredible individual that has ever held ministerial rank in any European country. Robert Habeck was at Davos. Quite extraordinary to think that, you know, for me, historically, remembering the old Green Party as it was when it was established, the idea of the founder of the Green Party, the German Green Party, Patrick Kelly, ever going to Davos is just, except as a protester, is, you know, is extraordinary to think Green politicians going to Davos. But anyway, they are. And he sounded, I thought, borderline hysterical. He was talking about, you know, he can't recognize Europe anymore, that there's betrayals on every front. Hungary is, you know, not doing the right thing. The worst of Europe is on show. I mean, this kind of language, deeply offensive to many people, very typical of a student activist. If you're not with me, you must be a scoundrel. I mean, that's basically his sort of line. And everybody who's you know, disagreeing with me must be disagreeing because they have some self-interested reason for disagreeing. So Orban wants to continue with his partnership with Putin. That was another thing that Habeck said. Well, those people like Habeck, Baerbock, and the rest, if they read the New York Times editorial, if they are listening to what Kissinger says, if they are getting a sense that the political sands in Washington are shifting, they must be extremely worried for themselves. Because make no mistake about it, if US changes course on Ukraine, if somebody in the United States makes a decision that this has gone far enough, if what this congressman, I'm not sure whether he's a serving congressman, Tim Cantor, apparently said in Davos that the United States is in danger of overplaying its hand and must now pull back. If that happens, then the position of people like Baerbock, Habeck, and the rest becomes untenable in Germany and in Europe. And to be straightforward about it, the political reaction in Germany, after all they put Germany through, would be so strong that I very much doubt that the Greens will ever be in government in Germany again. So for them, this is a very high stakes thing now. Now, I absolutely agree with what you were saying about the situation on the ground. I think that is what is driving it. There were two aspects to this conflict. One was the economic war, and this, the Biden people like Habeck, Baerbock, Johnson in Britain, they all expected that they would win it quickly. And we know that. We know that was their plan because, foolishly, the people in the White House actually went around at the time when they imposed the sanctions on the central bank, and they bragged about it. They're on record as saying that they were going to force the ruble to go into free fall, that they were going to create an inflationary crisis in Russia, that they were going to drain the country of its foreign reserves, that they were going to cripple its economy. And it wasn't just in the US. You had the French finance minister, Le Drian, saying exactly the same thing, that they were going to destroy the Russian economy. So that's not working. That's not going to plan. The other side was the war. Now, they didn't expect the war to go on as long as it has, because they thought that with the Russian economy imploding in March, it wouldn't need to go as long as it has. They thought that Russia would implode, there'd be a political crisis, they'd be able to sort it out, they'd be able to dictate terms. Well, it hasn't worked out like that. So they find themselves in a situation, in a war, where they're getting concerned that the Ukrainian army is being encircled and destroyed in eastern Donbass. And if people have been following all our channels, Robert's channel, our channel on the Duran, we were saying right from the start that the Russians have a Clausewitzian approach to war. They're not interested in capturing ground or cities. They're interested in destroying the opponent's army, thereby undermining their opponent's will and ability to keep fighting. And that is what they're coming increasingly close to doing, at least within sight of doing in eastern Ukraine. And I think, again, the penny has dropped. People are starting to see it. There's a shift, a major shift in mood in London. I was just looking at the Telegraph again. Now, the Telegraph is the reliable voice of the British Defence Ministry. And we see headline. This is the headline. It's the current headline. Russia seizes initiative in battle for the Donbass. That's what the Daily Telegraph is saying. That's not what they were saying a week ago. They've suddenly changed. The mood has changed. It's not yet panic. They've not yet reached the point of panic. But the more realistic amongst them is now saying the Americans are changing their minds. Time that we did too. We've got to find a way out. More difficult for us to do in Britain because our political system is stagnant. Whatever you may say about the US, you have a vital politics. I mean, there's people like Josh Hawley, there's people like, any number of people in the US, Rand Paul, people on the left, people on the right. There's active real politics in the United States. In Britain, we have lost that skill. Our politics are stagnant. Our politics are frozen. So it's very difficult to find somebody who isn't compromised and who can come forward and start to change course. But if America changes course, make no mistake about it, we will. We will follow where America leads, as we always do.
Robert, Alexander, real quick. Hungary's Orban declares a state of emergency over war and economy. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, this is from Bloomberg, declared a wartime state of emergency immediately after his new government was installed. The state of emergency, a new tool Parliament approved earlier on Tuesday, will take effect at midnight and will give the government, quote, maneuvering room and the ability to react immediately to the fallout from the war in neighboring Ukraine. Orban said in a video message on his Facebook page, the government will announce its first measures under the emergency on Wednesday, he said. That's the article. This is kind of breaking news. Robert, what do you think? Alexander, what do you think of this?
A couple of things. I mean, I'm not a fan of emergency powers by any government, even Orban, who, I mean, I like Orban, the only sensible European leader, arguably, that's in the EU at least. But not a fan of emergency powers. But this is Orban counteracting a whole bunch of things going on. So I understand why, just not a big fan of the emergency power aspect. Similar to the super chat question, I mean, part of actually the heart of Banderite Ukrainian nationalism comes from a part of Ukraine that was often part of the Austrian Empire, then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they were actually okay during that stage. Is when they got put in with the Poles, that was their main target. So, like, all this brotherhood talk is interesting. It's like, I get it. Like, the Poles dominated Western Ukraine for about 400 years, from the middle of the 14th century to the 17th, 18th century. But I don't know if that was brotherhood in the Ukrainian sense of the word, at least, because Banderites didn't exactly, their idea of brotherhood was to blow people up, kidnap the postman, engage in massive terrorism campaigns. They targeted the Poles long before they targeted the Russians. That part of Ukraine, I don't think was hardly ever within the Russian Empire, ever. It was, I mean, in fact, you can go all the way back. It had there was at one point its own country called Galicia, its own territory during beginning of the Mongol invasions. Kiev was separate, as the Principality of Kiev was separate from it. But these people do think of themselves as Ukrainian or Ukrainian nationalists, but they think of themselves originally when this group of people from Western Ukraine came to the United States and set up the first Ukrainian Nationalist Association, and it would become the center of all Ukrainian nationalist associations throughout all of North and Latin America. It has ideological influence to this day, which is striking. But when they started off, they didn't call themselves Ukrainian. They called themselves Ruthenian. And that's because from that part of Western Ukraine, basically they saw themselves as the inheritors of the Kievan Rus. Ruthenian is just another word for Russian. Ukrainian just means borderlander. Kind of still, I find it a weird nationality. I'm a borderlander. Okay, whatever. But that group of people, they started out as Ruthenians even in America in the late 1800s, before they switched to Ukrainian as a label. But there was a piece there. There's some Hungarian piece there. I don't think Orban's eager to grab a piece of Ukraine. That's just my take. But yes, a different Hungarian leader might. Yes, there's a Romanian part. I mean, there was parts of the parts of Ukraine that have some overlap with Romania, that border Romania. Also you have Moldova, of course, that's inside Ukraine's borders, that Romania thinks it has certain attachment to. Let's put it that way. And then you go all the way back. That was part of the Greater Bulgarian Empire, going all the way back. So there's history of that region being kind of in dispute, you might say, not part of the rest of Ukraine, which was totally different and separate with its history. But also to Alexander's point, it's the utility of predictability about what happened economically and militarily and politically. Because when I first had conversations in late February, early March with a bunch of with Senate candidates, House candidates, congressional staff members, think tank types, media folks, people close to Trump, my ace in the hole was being able to predict what we had predicted. Because if I was able to be accurate, say, here's what you're going to see over the next 30, 60, 90 days. And if we were more accurate, or if I was more accurate in talking to them than what the New York Times was saying, the Wall Street Journal was saying, all the think tanks were saying, all the foundation people, all the social media experts from the Army intelligence. I think I sent you one of these guys are still delusional. I mean, it's incredible reading their stuff. It's like, where do these people live? But they were predicting an entirely different thing. And there were a lot of political actors that weren't willing to take a gamble if Russia was going to collapse in 30 days anyway. Weren't going to take a gamble if Ukraine was going to win easy in the military conflict. Weren't willing to take a gamble if the whole global South was going to be against Russia. Weren't willing to take a gamble if the domestic populists would respond in a way as favorable to the U.S. position rather than adversarial to the U.S. position vis-a-vis the Biden administration. And on all four, my prediction was that the economy, or what I told him was, here's what you'll see over the next 30, 60, 90 days. This economic gamble won't work. Putin's 1997 thesis as a grad student is right. Food and fuel. This is, by the way, used to be a Kissinger quote. He who controls the food, he who controls the fuel. Now, Kissinger thought he who controls the money controls it all. He turned out he's wrong about that third premise. The first two were right. The third one was wrong. And that's what Putin's gamble was in 1997. control food, control fuel, you'll be self-sufficient. You have real security. And so my analysis was, what our analysis was Russia will be just fine. Russia doesn't depend on food. Russia's not Venezuela or Cuba. Russia does not depend on outside sources for food, does not depend on outside sources for fuel. And consequently, and in fact, relies on outside sources for almost nothing but luxury goods and certain manufactured items for the most part. All things they could really replace pretty quickly within the daily economy of the ordinary Russian. Their rent's not going to go up. Their petrol bill's not going to go up there. It's not like Britain. It's like Europe, where all of a sudden 5-fold increases, 10-fold increases. That wasn't going to happen there because they got their own. Being able to predict that was what was going to happen, rather than what all the deep state crowd was saying, predicted militarily Russia would not try to take all of Ukraine. Like, nobody wanted to be on the Russian side or say anything against the Biden administration if it was true that Putin was going to march through Ukraine and try to go to Poland, right? Said that's never going to happen. And that whatever happens early on, they often do multiple fronts. You can't pay attention. The focus is going to be Donbass. Look at what happened with South Ossetia. Imagine South Ossetia plus. They'll add a little bit more, but it'll be the historic lands that they had going all the way back to the 1700s. And the fact that is what ultimately took place, rather than what Milley and everyone else was predicting was going to happen militarily, and that the Ukrainians couldn't hold on long term. And then the political dynamic is the global South would not join, and that all the things that critics were saying, that these are a bunch of neo-Nazis and Zelensky's a grifter, you don't want to be anywhere near these people, it'll be embarrassing over time. Increasingly, they're getting to witness in live time. These Nazis, they can't help themselves. They're always filming stuff. I mean, apparently they filmed some of their torture stuff and kept their phones so that, I guess it looks like maybe the Azov battalion people told them this was a special project. It's not really a surrender. Don't worry. Then they hop on, the meme is they hop on the bus and they turn to see who's driving it, and it's Putin. And like, hold on a second. But apparently they took their phones with them that shows their crimes. It's like, I don't know what genius that is. But if you're watching from the West, you see more and more evidence of the neo-Nazis. You see more and more evidence that Zelensky is just an obvious kleptocratic grifter who's playing a role so he can cash out in Hollywood. You're seeing the wrong people be associated with this. If you're on the populist right, you don't want to be on the same side as Sean Penn and Angelina Jolie or the World Economic. The fact the World Economic Forum is cheering this conflict is going to further undermine its appeal within the American populist right. It will further remind them, we're right to be nowhere near this thing. And because all of those predictions are coming true is why the populist right is being more vocal, being more verbal. Now think tanks want to be part of it. Now more elected representatives want to be part of it. More institutional actors want to be part of it. And Trump is pretty much really committed to that. He has not said anything pro-war since he issued that statement about peace now. Once we won over Trump, once the populist right won over Trump on this, that meant it was only a matter of time before everybody else started falling in on the right. So I think that because of what's happened is why the American political electorate's moving the way it does. That in turn is moving the way the deep state is now divided. And I agree that whatever happens in the American deep state it's the way Europe will follow. Even though, Ursula von Crazy would love to do her own thing. But, I don't think realistically can. And it looks like Boris is on his last legs. He keeps surviving, but looks like he may finally be on his last legs in Britain, because I don't know how much the Brits are willing to keep writing higher and higher checks for a failed war in Ukraine.
That is exactly true. Let's just talk about Orban. Now, this may be connected. This decision to declare a state of emergency may be connected to the fact that he's in a major round now with the European Union. I mean, I mentioned Robert Habeck and how Robert Habeck at Davos criticized Orban in ferocious terms. But just earlier today, we got news that Orban has ruled out any discussion at the European Council meeting. Now, the European Council meeting, just to say, is the meeting that brings together heads of state and government of the European Union. It's the key decision-making body, and it has to work on most things, on some things, certainly on sanctions. It has to work by consensus. So Orban has a veto. Anyway, he's already made it clear in a letter to Charles Michel, who is the president of the European Council, that he is not prepared to discuss an oil embargo of Russia at the next European Council meeting. He says that European proposals for an oil embargo are far too vague, and that if they are implemented in their current form, or indeed one suspects in any form, that would result in a major crisis for the Hungarian economy, which he's not prepared to accept or allow. So now, if you're in Orban's position, you have to be aware of the fact that you've got the EU Council against you, most of the EU apparatus is against you, Germany's against you, Habeck is talking about, how you go in partnership with Putin, the French, the Italian government, Mario Draghi, all those people are against you, and the ally you relied upon, Poland, which shares your views on many things about the EU integration, well, that's now gone off on a frolic of its own. They're interested in Ukraine. They're talking about Galicia. They've got this crazy policy against Russia. So you can't rely on Poland anymore. So you may be facing disruptions from the EU targeting your economy, targeting you specifically. They might not be as dangerous as an oil embargo, but they might, for example, cut off EU funding, which is substantial. It's one of these many slush funds the European Union has, the so-called structural funds, for example, that go into various countries, go to various regions to support economies there, to build roads, to do all those kind of infrastructure things. The EU's been threatening to cut that off from countries that are non-compliant with EU policies and regulations. Now, they will not link it. If the EU cuts off funding, they will not link it to Orban opposing an oil embargo, because that would be too obviously a political thing. But they will root out, they will look for something else that they can say that Orban, Hungary, is in non-compliance with EU laws and regulations. So we're going to cut off funding to them. So I think this is a preemptive move by Orban. He's taking this very strong line on the oil embargo. He's taking this preemptive move. He's imposing this equivalent of a state of emergency. Like Robert, I loathe emergency powers. I think they are the most insidious and dangerous things to do in situations that are short of war. I mean, what they are all about ultimately is ways of doing away with due process, doing away with legal procedure, doing away with all the right things that should happen in a peaceful civil society. But this is why I think he's doing it, because he anticipates that next month there's going to be a concerted attack on him by the EU leadership. And with Robert Habeck's statements at Davos highlighting the dangers for him and for Hungary. Now, the other thing is, I have to say this, at least Orban is taking steps. At least he's sitting down. He's saying, I'm going to have these emergency powers. You may disagree with emergency powers, as I do, but at least he's sitting down. He's talking with his ministers. He's discussing things with his officials. He's strategizing about what to do in any given situation, given the kind of problems that might be thrown at Hungary. We are in an economic crisis in Europe. We're in an economic crisis in Britain. To be very clear, we are in a much worse position economically than the US is. I mean, the US is a continental economy. Contrary to what most people think, yes, the US imports a lot, but basically, overall, it's self-sufficient. It can get by. We in Europe are not in that position. And we in Britain, most especially, are definitely not. Are we strategizing? Are we sitting down? Are we saying to each other, what must we do? How are we going to resolve these problems? How are we going to keep the factories running? How are we going to keep people warm? How are we going to get the food in the shops? How are we going to prevent unemployment exploding? Are we doing any of those things? We're not. We are doing nothing. Here in Britain, it is terrible to see. All we're doing at the moment in Britain is we're simply printing more money, and we do not have the world's reserve currency in the way that the United States does. So that is what we are doing. We are not strategizing. We are not taking preemptive steps to prepare for the hard times which are to come. We are in denial about them. And of course, if we're Robert Habeck and Annalena Baerbock, I sometimes get the impression that these people do not like industry. They do not like modern industrial manufacturing. They would, frankly, almost at a visceral level, not be too sorry if it was all to go away, because after all, well, they're Greens, and doing that will save the planet. So I'm sorry that sounds a bit cynical and extreme, but I do wonder sometimes when I listen to these people whether they really do think that way.
To what degree do you guys, how hard would it be for Hungary or any of these other countries to exit the EU? Because, like, I mean, two things are happening. One is the EU, it seems to me, has been a failed experiment, but it seems like everybody feels they're locked in. It's like they feel like exiting is not an option other than Britain. And maybe it's the currency issue because Britain never went on the euro. And maybe that's what's got them stuck. But like when these kind of things happen, it seems like it would be in Hungary's interest, at least theoretically, to exit the EU and not be part of this nonsense anymore. What are some of the hurdles practical to that? And then do you think this internal finger pointing is going to continue to escalate? Because you look at the EU finger pointing at Hungary. You have Turkey saying we're not getting in the middle of a finger pointing match. We're going to maintain our relations with Russia. Erdogan's doing his constant, dance. But pretty clear he's going to, I mean, the way he trolled Sweden and Finland and, you can join NATO if you send one of your ministers down and just extradite him for a crime because we don't like him. I mean, that's not in my understanding of NATO, it has to be by consensus. I think if anyone objects, no one can join. I mean, there's talk of, is my understanding. Looking at the legal document, it's kind of a little bit odd. It just says by consensus. Normally you would say by unanimity, but it doesn't actually quite make that clear. But so it's not clear to me Sweden and Finland will be joining NATO. But and then you have the statements that Poland made about Norway, saying, "Hey, you greedy SOBs, you're making all this money off oil. You should, send us some of that extra cash." This is a lot of internal finger pointing in Europe. And all because they're wanting to fight over some part that's not part of the EU. It's not part of NATO. It's a little insane. But how much do you think the finger pointing will continue to escalate internally within Europe? And what is the hurdles to countries like Hungary getting out of the EU?
Right. Let's deal with the last point. Let's talk about Hungary leaving the EU. They are, in my opinion, purely psychological. Yes, Hungary does get a lot of support through the structural funds. Yes, there are trading connections between Hungary and the rest of the EU. Remember, it's a small country. It's a small economy. But I actually think, personally, that Hungary would be able to thrive outside the EU, and it can do it. It's still got its monetary independence. It is able to leave the EU with its economy intact, just as Britain was. It can forge connections with other countries, with Russia first and foremost. Massive potential market there, and China too. Hungary can do it.
Serbia.
It can probably do it. Serbia, it can do it faster actually than Britain can, because as it's a smaller economy, it can turn things around faster. There are problems, but they are psychological. Hungarians think of themselves very much as Europeans. They think of themselves very much as a bastion, a fortress of Catholic Christian Europe. They fought the Ottomans very heroically for centuries. They felt that they'd been detached from Europe, their conception of Europe during the Cold War, because they were, under the Soviet yoke. So psychologically, it's very difficult for many Hungarians to say we leave the EU. But to be absolutely clear, that is all that is holding them back in practical terms. Now, if you are a member of the Eurozone, if you are within the single currency, then it becomes, as we know to our cost in Greece, vastly more difficult. Firstly, you are under the heel of the European Central Bank because, in the run-up to any decision to leave the EU, they can do all kinds of things. They can screw up your banks. They can block, money coming through your system. They can seize money in your system. I mean, Alex can tell you all about that. It happened to him in Cyprus. They did it there. So they can put on incredible pressures. And of course, the fear that many people have in these countries, it was very real in Greece, especially amongst older people who are paid their pensions in euros, is that, of course, if you quit the Eurozone, if you come out of the Eurozone and your money is converted from the euro into the local currency, which in Greece would have been the drachma will immediately depreciate massively and your pension will be worth far less, perhaps nothing. And that keeps people afraid and it makes them stay. So that's the thing. The Eurozone is the prison. If you're outside the Eurozone, you can leave. And it's not so hard. If you're in the Eurozone, unless you're a big country, unless you're France, and even for France, it would be difficult. It would be traumatic, or at least that's what we all think. Alex can provide you details about what happened to him in Cyprus, how he woke up one day and found that all his money in the bank had been taken away from him. Do you want to just explain that to our viewers?
No, I mean, I'm just going off of what you said and what Robert said. It's the Eurozone. It's the euro, the money. That's what holds the countries in. I mean, they shut off your ATM, Robert, just like that. I mean,
yes.
You wake up one morning and all the ATMs, no more money. We've gone into your bank and that's it. But they did give, it was Schäuble. Schäuble did give Greece an off-ramp.
Yes.
He said, Greece, you can leave the Eurozone. We'll give you 50 billion euros, 5 years, get out. Yeah. Germany, there was a part of Germany that did not want Greece in the Eurozone. And Schäuble, the finance minister at the time, he did give Greece an off-ramp, and Greece said, no, we want to stay.
Yeah.
We want that currency. So I think Hungary could easily make it out. And I think Hungary-Serbia could be an interesting play. I mean, Hungary is landlocked, but there could be some alliances there. I don't know. I don't know what you guys think, but I think Hungary could make it.
I think Hungary could make it. I mean, I absolutely could make it. And of course, but as I said, there is this issue that, that they find it very difficult to imagine themselves out of Europe. And one of the terrible things that's happened is the way in which the concept of Europe has been fused in political speak with the European Union. So we act as if the two are one and the same. So that's where I think Hungary's problems are. But anyway, that's I think the politics in Hungary. That's why Orban has done this dramatic thing, why he's decided to impose these emergency rules, because he anticipates an attack coming. But it's not going to come from Moscow. It's not going to come from Washington. It's going to come from Brussels and to some extent from Berlin.
Now, I assume Brussels is eager to do so because they're still unhappy that he won by the margin he won in the first place.
Absolutely.
They spent all that effort, and he, of course, called him out in his victory speech explicitly. So that wouldn't, but it shows, I think it's the same here in the United States. This sort of, Tucker Carlson had a rant about it, that what we're seeing in a lot of policies by whether you call them neoliberals or democratic political establishment, whatever you label them internally here, it's the failure of their policies is leading to crazier policies. And that, in the sense, like what you guys are describing in Europe, is the failure of this attack, this using Ukraine to end Russia, is leading to Poland arguing with Norway, Turkey trying to keep Sweden and Finland out, EU waging war against Orban because he's the one dissident member. Even though my understanding also on NATO is that for their own reasons, Croatia doesn't want certain countries added because of where that might lead. But so in the U.S., similarly, I mean, Tucker's rant was that the failure of liberal policies is leading to what he called rage, just kind of almost insane set of policies, but that policies that are getting sort of worse and more disconnected and disattenuated from reality. And that's in part what's happening. I think that like the Kissinger wing of the deep state that wants to get out of this doesn't want to go down the self-destructive path that these other groups are on. And it's very much it's our way, or if it's not our way, we blow it all up. I mean, it's almost like that kind of mindset mentality. Like the summer of love, which is more like the summer of rage of 2020, is almost like the natural next step for a lot of these crowds that are not getting what they want. They're not getting what they want in the disinformation governance board. They're not getting what they want, and that they're also were the neoliberal Americans. Some people asked, "What's a neoliberal, neoconservative?" I call them these days, since the mid '90s, and particularly through Hillary Clinton, that it's really globalist versus nationalist more often than anything else. What it is neoliberal, neoconservative for people who grew up in the '90s is a quick proxy for warmongers. Is the easiest way to describe it. They're people who like intervention, who like using military, political, financial means to get involved in other people's lives. And neoliberal was just they did it in the name of the liberal rules of order or whatever nonsense was their self-justification, self-rationalization, whereas neocons were more seen as doing it in the name of American freedom, American security, sort of American empire, leveraging America as a global example to the world through force, military or financial. And that's heavily the neocon phrase all the way back was, ex-commies basically, who flipped in the 70s, Irving Kristol and others, and it was represented a small little intellectual group. Over time, it's represented everybody who sees war or foreign intervention as a useful means to some political objective, either of themselves or of a globalist order. I consider it more globalist because this is when people on the left call it an empire, American empire. It's one of the weirdest empires ever. It's an empire that impoverishes the domestic population and kills off the domestic population. Popular empires bring home treasure and limit the amount of blood loss. They don't increase the amount of blood loss and reduce the domestic treasure. That's what this so-called empire does. I consider it more of a globalist project aligned with George Soros's ideas than aligned with anything American. Looks a lot more like George Soros than Teddy Roosevelt, put it that way. And so and that's where that alignment is. But within, the domestic policies within the U.S. are just increasingly like, if this was a strategy, let's have a Ukrainian conflict, prove that we're still the shining example of liberty and freedom and democracy and whatever, and Zelensky is the new magical beacon. He's the Nelson Mandela of Europe. That kind of imagery that they're trying to build up, idolatry, really. If that was the goal to boost Biden, it hasn't worked. Biden's ratings keep going down, 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 and down. And they probably made a mistake by blaming any economic conditions on this conflict. Because you can look through almost all of human history. And if a war will not be popular with a local population if it increases the risk to their well-being and decreases their pocketbook. Realistically, when wars have been popular domestically, it's when they think they're really necessary to defend themselves. The Great War in Russia, as they call it, the World War II for them, the Great Patriotic War. That is popular to this day because they defended themselves in their view. Pretty good, clearly did defend themselves. And then the other, like the old Vikings, the old Mongols, the old Romans, the old empires, it increased the wealth of the domestic community. It was the British Empire was perceived as increasing the wealth of the domestic community, not costing them it, not costing money. I mean, that's kind of like Trump in his own, brutally blunt realpolitik way. It's like, if we're not getting the oil, why are we going? What's the deal? Right? I mean, that's that kind of mentality of how does this benefit us? These conflicts don't. And by reminding everybody, calling it Putin's price hike, like Jennifer Granholm did in front of Josh Hawley to his irritation, all that did is, one, remind Republicans they should not be on board with this war because it'll be used as a pretext and excuse for all of Biden's mistakes. It was a reminder of that. But the other is, it reminds the American public that to the degree they are unhappy with current economic conditions, they can blame Biden's decision to get involved in this conflict. I mean, that's why it was a mistake. It wasn't like people were going to go, Putin's price hike. Oh, I hate you, Putin. I'm now more for the war because I have to pay more for gas. Like, that was the mindset of the people who promoted that, who pitched that. That was never going to translate to the ordinary American voter. I mean, like, why the heck am I paying something because of something with Ukraine? That makes no sense to me. And the polling, when you dug in from day one, showed that people were not willing to pay a higher price to support the effort, whether that was a higher price in risk of war with Russia, whether that was higher price in the form of American soldiers on the ground, or a higher price in terms of real dollars. The reason why Mitch McConnell had to rush that through the Senate, aside from not letting Rand Paul impose an inspector general to show it's a real deep state money grab, was because it's not popular. And he had to rush it through so it didn't gestate amongst the American public for very long. Because you could tell within just the social media world, this was an extremely unpopular bill. Even people who don't care one way or the other about the Ukrainian conflict were like, why are we sending $40 billion to anybody rather than spending it here? Foreign aid has never been popular in the United States outside of emergencies like hurricanes, and even then, that money. Look at what happened to Haiti. That money didn't end up in the Haitians' hands; it ended up in the Clintons' hands and some other places. And Haitian kids ended up on some orphans ended up on some involuntary trips to Epstein Island, or its equivalent. So I think that's the kind of the same thing's happening domestically. Biden is sinking like a rock. We have a bunch of primaries today here in the states. In Georgia, it looks like Kemp will win, which will be a slight blow to Trump. But Ratberger, the Secretary of State, I think may lose. I was opposite to him on a lot of the Trump election litigation. Patrick Witt, may win. Some Trumpists may win. Marjorie Taylor Greene probably will win her primary safely. And in Texas, it may mean the end of the Bush family, at least temporarily. Abe Bush has held elected office every single year since 1981. And if you go further back to the family chain, they've held office at some level, like going back to the late 1800s at some point between the two family trees. George P. Bush, he was considered the future because he was half Latino. So he was Jorge Bush, right? He's another George Bush. So he's in the George Bush family tradition name, but he was Jorge Bush. That was their process of how we'll get this is why they were pro-immigration. They thought this was the key to the Bush family political legacy. And while Papa, well, in this case, his uncle, George is his uncle, was busy getting pranked by Ukraine, pretending to be Zelensky, and he's sitting there answering the call and disclosing all kind of, we're this a proxy war with Russia, yeah. Well, I tried to do that with Georgia, yeah, ha. I mean, just guys, he's a gift. And then, of course, the greatest gift of all time, his speech about, you can't just go unilaterally, brutally invading places on one man, like I did in Iraq. Classic Bush. But his nephew tried to challenge Ken Paxton, the populist attorney general from Texas, the one who led the election dispute up to the United States Supreme Court on behalf of Trump. And Paxton's had some separate. He was another person that was targeted, along with Madison Cawthorn, J.D. Vance, and other people on the line. But it looks like Paxton's going to win with ease because the Texas Republican primary voter is a very populist voter. And even in a state where his uncle was governor, George P. Bush looks like he's going to go down to not only a defeat, but a bad defeat, which tells you something about between that and his uncle being in the news, ex-President George W. Bush, for disastrous comments about foreign policy, tells you a little bit where the Republican electorate is. Yeah. The one caveat to all of that is the Kinzinger-Cawthorn distinction. So, like, people ask me, like some from the anti-war left, they're like, the American people are just bloodthirsty. They've always been bloodthirsty. They killed the Indians, enslaved black people, blah, blah, all that kind of line. And it's like, okay, I get the commie script from the 1970s, but at least you could update it a little bit. But but as to they say Americans really support these various foreign wars that the government has or the CIA has waged. One could go back to, John F. Kennedy, who didn't want Lumumba killed, who they killed him anyway before he could do anything about it. And John Kennedy, who told various officials, including the French ambassador during the attempted coup that the U.S. backed against the French president, against de Gaulle, said, I'm the president, but I'm not even fully in control of the CIA, so I can't tell you what they did or didn't do. So you have that problem in that you have an unelected bureaucracy often does whatever they want regardless of elected officials. But the other aspect is the problem of representative government. You just have a gap, and it's best represented in the Kinzinger-Cawthorn distinction in terms of why would somebody vote against their own constituents? The reason is Kinzinger and Cawthorn. Kinzinger voted for impeachment, and he has been the number one congressional cheerleader for the Ukrainian conflict. He's the one who put out Sam Hyde as the ghost of Kiev. I mean, that's who this genius is. Continues to promote a wide range of fake news. We had the Wolverines. He ticked off Amanda Milius, the daughter of John Milius, the great director of Red Dawn, and a lot of other great films. Because he did a Red Dawn version, Wolverines, Ukraine was now fighting Red Dawn. That was Red Dawn 3, Ukraine. That was the thing. He actually had T-shirts with it. But that gives you. But so why is he doing that? Why is Kinzinger? Now Kinzinger's not running for re-election. He would have been crushed. He was a number one target of Trump. He ran as a Tea Party conservative and turned out not to be anything like that once in office. The reason is simple. When he finishes, because he's been why is he in particular obsessed with you promoting the Ukrainian conflict? When he leaves office, he'll get professorship deals. He'll get think tank deals. He'll get media contract deals. He'll get book writing. I mean, look at Jill Biden. She had a bunch of money for a book. So did Hunter Biden. Almost nobody bought the book. It's just disguised money laundering. And by the way, a lot of these book publishing deals are connected to European companies, connected to EU and German enterprises. Yeah, you dig in a little bit further, and they have some interesting, let's say, political ancestry on some of the German side. But they're going to get and they get prestige, right? They get the status, they get the honor. You're an important intellectual. You're an important person, and because we'll promote you in the media, in the book world, in the academy, in the think tank world, and you get to write your own check for the rest of your natural born days. By contrast, take Madison Cawthorn. Madison Cawthorn snuck into office. Madison Cawthorn didn't do some constituent things well that he should have. He had a bunch of personal scandals that could become overblown, but could be made a big deal of. But what really drove the establishment nuts was he was very populist on January 6th on the election-related issues. But especially, he had a key decision to make when the whole Ukrainian conflict was coming on board. Had he decided to go on the deep state side, he does not face a meaningful challenge and he wins re-election despite all these other issues. But he decides to be very anti the deep state side. Now, that was very popular within his populist base, but what it led to was full throttle deep state opposition. So all of a sudden, he has media hit pieces written out all over the place. They do a mass deep dive into his personal history and smear him every which way but Sunday. Unless you have no problems or nothing that could be perceived as a problem, and that's going to be almost nobody, that definitely not anybody's in public office, but that's going to be mostly nobody. You're going to run into trouble. They recruited one of the best candidates against him, a state senator from the most populist part of the district. And then 3 Democratic judges or 3 democratically aligned judges change his district unilaterally from what the legislature passed and carve off a big populist rural part of his district so that it's much more rooted in Asheville, which Asheville has a lot of old school, more of a bunch of hippies move there that, will eat granola and believe in climate change and all that crap. And a good number of them unaffiliated could turn over and vote in the Republican primary. And then there was unusual turnout tendencies. Now, the good news from a populist perspective, despite all the things, all the massive amount of money he faced, all the media opposition he faced, all the smear campaigns he faced, the changing of his actual congressional district, weird levels of unaffiliated voters voting in the Republican primary from the Asheville area, unusual mail-in balloting and early voting tendencies for that district. Despite all those things, he almost won. But look at Madison Cawthorn's future. There's no think tank's going to give him a job. No media, big institutional network's going to give him a gig. No, Georgetown ain't giving him an adjunct professorship, least of all a commencement speech. No book deal. No, there won't be a big public book publisher. His book will be a lot more popular than a Kinzinger book. Almost no major book publisher is going to sign him up. And that's how the system, the deep state, maintains control, is that your personal well-being is divorced from the well-being of your own constituents and the express interest of your own constituents. And that's how the deep state operates in the United States. The upside is, broadly, their agenda hasn't been more unpopular than any time since after World War I. We're looking at 1920s level populist opposition, back when we had the War Racketeering Committee, et cetera. I mean, if they don't like what Rand Paul is doing, wait till J.D. Vance is in the United States Senate. So, so this is a guy who fought in Iraq and hasn't forgot that they lied to get him there. This is like Frank Church, the greatest reform in the history of the only time the deep state ever faced meaningful opposition. And we can bridge into next the Sussman trial and why I think that won't go places where people think it will go. But the last time the deep state actually faced consequences was after Watergate, and Frank Church got to have a special select committee on intelligence, and he was the one who did all the assassination, MK Ultra, all that stuff. That was all him. Why? Because the NSA, the first person they ever spied on of elected representative was Senator Frank Church. Back when they had populist Democrats from Idaho, it's a whole different history. So I think, but Biden's unpopularity continues to go down and down and down. And his comments today about Taiwan, it tells me that I think now, originally I thought that they're using these investigations to extort him into a certain set of policies. And there may be aspects of that are true, but I think increasingly they may be escalating that personal risk to him to get him to resign because they don't think they can even keep him on a verbal leash. That he really, it's a conversion of a confession through projection filter. I think you guys call it the mirror principle. Is, think about everything they've said about Russia during the war was often true about Ukraine. In the same vein, or the West. In the same vein, what they've been saying about Putin, mysterious health problem, might die tomorrow, not even mentally capable. They may be just describing what Joe Biden is, and that they're nervous now that it's not just about staying on the agenda. It's and being a political disaster because Harris is just not a substitute to solve that problem. It may be because they really just can't keep him on script. You can't give him enough, pills and Jello to keep them, on board. And so you may see continued escalation of the Biden family investigations. I don't know if Biden lasts another year. If he keeps going off the res like this, I think and when you have people like Kissinger and others in the deep state saying this was really a poorly mapped strategy, then you're going to have even more opposition and reason to push Biden aside and bring Kamala Harris into the White House.
Very interesting. Just going back to your previous question that you put, which is, are we getting recriminations in Europe and are they going to grow? They are going to grow exponentially. The fact that the Poles are criticizing the Norwegians is a sign that, things are getting really bad, because bear in mind, the Poles, having cut themselves off from Russian oil and gas, have to rely on Norway. That's where it comes from in the EU now. So, the fact that they're prepared to bite the hand that's literally feeding them shows how ugly the mood in Europe has become. But, and this is the difference, in Europe, we can't resolve these recriminations because the political structures we've created for ourselves, both at the EU level and internally, are such that you can never get a full or proper resolution. Whereas in the United States, you at least in theory can. You can control the political system up to a point in exactly the way that you said. A person who speaks out of line, he finds that everything is then used to get him out of his congressional district, that he loses his position as a congressperson. He's got no prospects going forward. He can't get his professorship. He can't get his position in the think tank community. He's not going to be able to write his book. You can do that in the United States to a very great extent. But because you are one country and because you have political traditions there, there's always going to be someone else who will come forward. And of course, if there's people who listen and people who support what you do, then that creates a political force. In Europe, we don't have that. Politics is fragmented amongst different countries, and it is much easier to control. And at the EU center, which remember is where a lot of the decisions are made now, at the EU center in Brussels, you don't get elections at all. Ursula von der Leyen is not an elected official, nor is Charles Michel, nor is Josep Borrell. None of these people have to face voters. And that makes a decisive difference. And of course, if we're talking about Europe, generally European states, we have these very complicated electoral systems that exist in every European state. We don't have this ability to change policies, to change movements in the way that you do in the United States. Now, I have to say, I am very, very relieved and pleased to hear that you think that you're starting to think that there might be something going to happen with these cases, and that Biden might be out fairly soon. I say that because with every single passing day, I'm really getting more and more concerned that this is an extremely dangerous administration indeed. It's catastrophic in terms of its economic policies. Its social policies are awful. I'm not going to even start on the way it's complete contempt and disregard for law and for due process, and essentially for the safeguards of the Constitution. But I mean, its foreign policy is a complete nightmare. And I have to say, the Chinese, listening to those comments on Taiwan, you have many people have strong feelings about China, but you've got to put that to one side, because whatever it is, it's a power. The Chinese listen to Biden. They hear him say one thing to them in private. He then goes out and he blurts something out like this. They say to themselves, we can't trust this man. He tells us one thing in private. He says and does something else in public. His administration is incredibly dangerous. We have got to start preparing for the war that is to come. Our friends in Russia found that they had to do that. They had no choice but to make their big move in Ukraine, because otherwise they realize that you can't trust Biden. You can't trust this administration. I'm sure the Chinese are saying the same thing. And they had a meeting apparently a few weeks ago of all the top banks in China. And they're all together in Beijing with the ministers, the Chinese officials, preparing for the financial sanctions that the Chinese believe are coming. And of course, they're also looking at filling up their oil reserves with Russian oil, again, because they expect that the administration at some point is going to try and impose some kind of energy blockade on them. And they have been goaded. That's how they see it. I mean, Biden might be blundering. He might be saying all sorts of crazy and stupid things. He may be saying what comes into his head. He may be coming up with all sorts of things. But the way the Chinese see it is that they're being goaded into a war over Taiwan. They don't particularly want to go to war over Taiwan. Why is it in their interests to go into war over Taiwan? But China cannot allow Taiwan to drift away. No Chinese government can survive that. Xi Jinping certainly can't survive it. He's much more likely to survive an oil blockade and financial sanctions than he is to survive the loss of Taiwan. So having a president who has done all these catastrophic things in the economy, and make no mistake, the inflation is his. Again, all of us three were saying that. We were saying that the day he became president and he announced all his massive spending programs. You can go back, you can watch our early programs. We said it's going to result in an inflation crisis. That inflation crisis is going to be transmitted all around the world. And the idea that it's going to be transient is stupid. He's created the inflation crisis. He's created all kinds of other problems as well. He's done real damage to the constitutional and legal system of the United States, coming on top of the damage that has been done previously by Barack Obama and by the deep state with all these other things. We'll talk about the Sussman trial in a moment, I think. But coming on top of that, Biden has taken that a whole massive step further. I can remember in one of our live streams, Robert, you asked us a rhetorical question. Can you ever remember a worse administration than this? The answer is I can't. And not only that, but I can't remember a more dangerous administration than this. So I hope that this old man is shunted away, put out to pasture, that however bad Kamala Harris is, she can't be worse or more dangerous than this. And maybe once he's out of the way, we can start to do some things that will gradually put the pieces together in the United States and give us rational economic policies and realistic foreign policy ones.
Yeah, I mean, I think what saved Biden so far is both Kamala Harris's intense unpopularity publicly, and as vice president, she has surprised. I always told people she was the dumbest lawyer ever dealt with in court. She was the attorney general of California, and she failed the bar first time. Not a coincidence. People are seeing in live time she is really slow. There's no other way to put it. And so the combination of her public unpopularity, that no matter how bad Biden falls, she stays beneath him, and in the institutional doubt that she can't keep a staff, that everybody's like, we don't know if she, that's the only thing that salvaged Biden so far. But the fact that no matter what he does in Ukraine, I mean, now he's talking about possible war with Russia, possible war with China, and then they even had leak that we're working with Israel to maybe do a war against Iran. It's like, well, we're going to do all three at the same time. I mean, did he confuse Russian roulette with nuclear roulette? I mean, it's just one dumb thing after the next. So, but I think he must have to be completely falling apart for them to want to risk a Kamala presidency, given that from a midterm perspective, she's still more unpopular than Biden. So that's why that may save him through the midterms. But if they get crushed in the midterms anyway, then that's its own thing. But I think increasingly it's his mental state. If we apply that confession through projection filter, that what they're saying about Putin is really true about Biden, somebody that's incompetent, dangerously incompetent, losing emotional control, might die at any moment, that kind of stuff. That I think that increasingly is of Biden, because that would explain what I consider the escalating Justice Department activities. Now, some people think they're just an honest Justice Department investigating where crime goes. Okay, if you believe that, God bless you. There's not a lot of evidence of it since 1980. Outside of that late 1970s period, and even Mark Felt, Deep Throat himself, who ran COINTELPRO, was a massive criminal at the FBI. That's the real reason why Ben Bradley and Bob Woodward hid his identity from the world. He wasn't this great noble whistleblower. He was a deep state J. Edgar Hoover coup operator who overthrew Nixon just because Nixon didn't make him head of the FBI. But he got told to walk. I mean, those deep state prosecutions of the late 70s disappeared as soon as Reagan got in. He pardoned almost everybody. Since then, nobody can point to me a deep state protected government operator who's been meaningfully criminally prosecuted. You could argue Oliver North, but that was a very political dynamic. It had a bit of a different animal, I think. So as an example, but the sign that they want to put more pressure on Biden is that they're going to taxes. There's no way any of them can survive. The problem with that kind of criminal operation that they were running, which was basically laundering bribes through various lobbying organizations, family members, etc. That's why Hunter was getting paid for briberism. It wasn't because of his sudden oil expertise. And they got him stashed away at a Malibu drug rehab. That's what he's doing in Malibu. It's one of those rehabs that's a private, off the books rehab. So they create these big mansions and they buy them next to each other in Malibu, and they make them small micro rehabs. So there's the big, well-known rehabs, but they weren't going to have Hunter there. They were going to have him in one of these that has only like 8 residents, and he lives next door or lives like down the street from it, that kind of gig. But basically, they got him stashed away so he doesn't say anything stupid to anybody and can't lose any more laptops to hookers in hotels. So that's where that. But the fact they're starting to talk about taxes, that's going to implicate Biden's brother, Biden's sister, and Hunter Biden and Biden himself. Because, I mean, Biden wasn't living on a Delaware beach house before he got his sweetheart money laundering book deal after he left the White House. He had that house before then and had other properties and benefits like that before then. He was getting that through laundered money through Hunter, and nobody was paying tax on it. Instead, they had Hollywood lawyers trying to write off liens and things like that. That was another way of bribery. I'll pay your tax. You're going to do this. That's what that was. It was an open secret with Joe Biden when he was vice president. people used to pitch me that they could get my client in a criminal case completely off if my client paid this person this much money because they would talk to Joe Biden who would get rid of it. Now, I kept my client out of that for a lot of reasons, but that's how open it was. I mean, it was a barely hidden secret that for X amount of money, Joe Biden's your man. Now, where he could really deliver was foreign policy. Tough to get criminal cases quashed like that in the United States. Not so hard to get them quashed, say in Ukraine, hey, here's your $1 billion as long as that case goes away or that prosecutor goes bye-bye. So the fact they're looking at taxes means they're just continuing to escalate. And if they look at the taxes, all of them are going to be implicated in a wide range of criminal conspiracies. That would be political career ending, et cetera. My guess is that they'll never actually bring the prosecution because of where that might lead. You can't tip Hunter over without tipping over a bunch of deep state bad actors. You can't even tip them over without tipping over the biolab in Ukraine problem. So it's tough to tip that over. They don't usually do that route. They threaten it rather than use it. And it's more likely they just get Joe to sign resignation papers. And then the big question, Alexander, is would Kamala actually manage to somehow be worse than Joe Biden? Unfortunately, from my personal experience, or whether that's actually conceivable, it seems inconceivable at the moment. I mean, he's talking about nuclear war with 3 different countries at the same time, no less. I mean, it's just insanity. While our economy is collapsing, Richard Barris of the People's Pundit has a poll out at the People's Pundit locals page, which shows that the economic numbers are the worst they've ever been internally. In other words, this American subjective definition, that both their current conditions and their expectations of the future are both abysmal. 80% of Americans basically they think their current situation is bad and think that the future is bad. And that's a bad combination politically, electorally going in to a midterm electorate. But yeah, it may be that Biden ultimately, if they keep escalating, if people keep seeing these kind of leaks drop of especially tax investigations and hidden money that went back and forth between Biden family members that was never disclosed, that does suggest that we'll randomly see a Joe Biden resignation at some point. They'll prep that for a couple of weeks of some sort of story. I always thought they might whack him with COVID or claim they whacked him with COVID to justify the pandemic thing. But that'd be if you're in the false flag fun universe. But I think
monkeypox.
Yeah, exactly. Monkeypox. That would be very apropos. There's a lot of memes about monkeypox that just makes sense. And with Joe Biden, I mean, we have a living monkey as a president. But but Kamala Harris, it'll also be who she picks as her VP. I mean, there are rumors. You all of a sudden saw Hillary Clinton start to make the rounds again. So we'll see what that means. I have no doubt she would like to get back in. But so we'll see what they do. I don't think they would like to not pull the trigger on that until 2023 because Kamala's still more unpopular than Biden in the national electorate. But they may not have a choice. But I think they'll definitely do it before 2023 because that would also mute various impeachment efforts Republicans may bring when they take over the House. So, but I would say right now, if I was betting odds, 50-50, Biden survives to 2024. Fulfills his term. Just too many. I don't think they're going to give him like a Ron Brown trip special to the Balkans kind of thing. Visit a war-torn region in the middle, for commerce purposes while you're under criminal grand jury investigation. But I think that will continue. Now, in the Sussman trial, that I think Durham is doing a massive cover-up operation more than an expose. That doesn't mean he's not exposing important facts in the process, because he is, and that's because I think he never thought Sussman would go to trial. He thought it was like when they went after the Russians, Mueller did. He thought the Russians would never show up to fight, and instead one of the companies did, and he had to drop all the charges ultimately. People forget that aspect because of how embarrassing it was, because he couldn't produce the evidence that confirmed his theory, which was a nonsense theory in my view, about Russian interference in the 2016 election. What's been determined in the Sussman trial is that Hillary Clinton orchestrated Russiagate, that it was a massive criminal operation, really, but at least an illicit operation. And here's what was criminal about it. They lied on their campaign finance reform or campaign finance papers and claimed that they were paying lawyers for legal expenses. What they were really paying for was a smear operation in Russiagate, was an October surprise against Trump. And that was Robbie Mook, her campaign manager, confirmed in court that she orchestrated it, organized it, and approved it. Other confirmation throughout the trial is what was really going on is they were also laundering information, laundering intel. And the way it's a classic deep state operation. So it's like if people understand aspects of Ukraine or understand aspects of Russiagate, or understand what's happening in the Sussman trial, the best, or what to make of the evidence out of the Sussman trial, read Graham Greene's Our Man in Havana, or watch the film. Read Jean Le Carré's Taylor of Panama, or watch the film. This is how, and it's why, like, people have been asking, Jacob Dreisen made the good point, why do you have such discrepancy between intelligence operatives and true, honest military analysts? Like, military analysts are just giving you the facts on the ground, here's da da da. Whereas almost all the fake military analysis coming out of the West, you dig into their biographies, and they're intel operators. That's what they did. They were, even if they were in the army, they were part of the intelligence at some level. And I think it's part of that whole subculture that Graham Greene captures and Jean Le Carré captures. They just make stuff up that's convenient, right? And that's what Christopher Steele did. Found a bunch of rumors, found a bunch of stories, put them together, called it a dossier. And that was it. And somehow you call it MI6 dossier, and magically it's elevated from crap to truth. And that's what all of Russiagate was. That's what a lot of what we're seeing with Ukraine is. You take bits and pieces and you script a crazy narrative. That's how you get Ghost of Kiev. That's how you get Go to Hell, Russia on Snake Island. That's how you get We Reconquered Snake Island. That's how you get the Great Siege of Kharkiv. While they keep getting beat, surrender, beat, surrender. That's the daily story of the war. That, I think, dynamic is what you see in the Sussman trial, because what they did is they had bogus intel. Oh, hey, there's a secret communication. Dan Abrams, son of Floyd Abrams, the famous New York Times lawyer, the brother of a prominent New York federal judge, the ABC News legal editor, the founder and owner of Law and Crime. He argued with me because his publication, because Rachel Stockman was the editor at the time, her dad being David Stockman, published me about Spygate back in January of 2017. Dan Abrams got blowback because, like, how dare you have somebody saying that anybody was spying on Trump, or that there was any of this illicit, laundered information? Because my theory was they took illicit information from illicit spying and surveillance, laundered it through the law firm as legal services for campaign finance reporting purposes, then had the law firm use their political contacts and connections to tell the FBI about it, then had the FBI confirm to the media that such an investigation existed. Then the same source, they would have the same source of bogus intel go to 3 different people and have those 3 people confirm the story independently to one another. Right? I mean, it's like Taylor of Panama, Our Man in Havana. It's like a classic version. You just start making up stories, you start adding facts together, and all of a sudden you unleash a wild set of events. That's what Russiagate was. Michael Sussman was this high-level corporate lawyer who was able to get on the phone and get the general counsel to the FBI to just have a chat with him, right? In the middle of a campaign, knowing he's a Democratic lawyer. The reason why he lies to the FBI and says he's not representing a client isn't because the FBI didn't know he was representing a client. It was and that's why he's annoyed, and that's why he's defending the case. The real reason was so that his pals at the FBI on the 7th floor that runs the FBI could put in their internal notes, we don't know that this is client connected, politically connected. And they could then hide the information from the agents downstream who thought they were getting a hot tip of a major criminal investigation, not knowing they got a politically bogus piece of information that's just being relaundered to the press. Because the other reason he goes to the FBI is because the New York Times isn't going to run the story unless they know the FBI is investigating. That's the other scam that's taking place. You get the FBI to investigate, and then they confirm that to the New York Times. So then the New York Times then runs the story. Major FBI criminal investigation. Was Donald Trump in secret communication through Alpha Bank to the Russian government? Like the Russian government's going to communicate. I mean, some of this was just insanity on top of insanity. The FBI's own data analysts, when they looked at this, said they thought a mental patient wrote it. That's what they thought of Russiagate, the dossier. This was written by a mental patient. This is just so bad technically, so bad analytically, so bad contextually, no one could credibly and intelligently believe it. It turns out these people working for the Clinton campaign were also paid informants by the FBI in separate matters, because it's all part of one deep state, corrupt, collusive world. So it's nice about the Sussman trials that has exposed it all. The downside is this. If John Durham was serious about meaningfully criminally prosecuting and punishing the deep state, he does not cut a sweetheart deal with Kleinsmith. Kleinsmith was the FBI lawyer who they caught red-handed perjuring, falsifying a FISA affidavit, an affidavit to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act Court. They gave him a sweetheart deal, didn't require he cooperate, didn't require he turn on anybody. He got no time, and he was relicensed as a lawyer within a year. So once that deal, whereas Kleinsmith was the one who had the dibs on Peter Strzok, had the dibs on James Baker, the FBI, not George Bush's James Baker, but general counsel to James Comey, James Baker. And Strzok is the kind of, you can tell that guy is such a wuss. He would have flipped on everybody if he was actually under the gun. But classic deep state operator. So once he didn't do that, that meant Durham was never going up. So we'll get lots of great intel out of this trial because I'm sure Durham thought Sussman would cut a plea. He's in D.C., so all the judges like him, all like the Democratic side of the aisle. They gave Kleinsmith the sweet deal. This guy lied as a lawyer in a sworn under penalty of perjury affidavit to the most consequential surveillance organization in the United States, which is the FISA court, because of the scale and scope at what it can order. It goes beyond what a federal district court, frankly, can order. And yet he did no time at all, not even a day, not even one day. Whereas, George Papadopoulos gets one or two things wrong and he has to serve actual jail time. It had nothing to do with institutionalized corruption and mass spying.
Mm.
So but Sussman won't, because Sussman is that arrogant. These people, this is the part of the deep state, going back to the original part of our conversation. This is the part of the deep state that combines arrogance, corruption, and incompetence. This is not the Kissinger wing. This is the one that's moral compass is just as broken as Kissinger, but their intellectual compass is broken as well. And that's what makes them different and more dangerous. And we're seeing it in the dementia candidate that's president. So Sussman took the case to trial, even though they have him dead to rights. He told them verbally and in writing, by multiple sworn testimony and by written evidence, I'm not representing a client when he was. That's a material lie to the FBI. Now, he may have done so. They're all in on it. You lie so that I can lie kind of deal. But that doesn't change it from a criminal law perspective. Still guilty. But he's so arrogant. He's like, how dare you bring me to charge? Do you understand who I am? That's Michael Sussman's approach. That's the only reason we're finding this stuff out, is because Durham had to take it to trial. But Durham's history, Durham helped cover up CIA rendition, interrogations, and spying on the Senate back then. He was the special counsel whose report never went public. He's the guy who recommended no criminal prosecutions related to, John le Carré's A Most Wanted Man, real living times in terms of renditions, but also what was happening with illicit interrogations by the CIA. And John Brennan and crew were spying on the Senate during that investigation. He did nothing about that. He's praised as the guy who exposed Whitey Bulger in Boston. What people don't understand is he actually kept it under wraps. His job is to come in, find a couple of scapegoats, and make sure the big players get to walk. That's his goal. It's like if you're going in the mob, pick off a few middlemen, make sure the big guys walk. That's what Durham's expertise is. Because the guy that was connected to Whitey Bulger in Boston, who was in Boston in the 1980s, a certain assistant United States attorney named Robert S. Mueller. Somehow Mueller's name never gets implicated in the Whitey Bulger scandal. That's who and what Durham is. So Durham is not going after Clapper, Brennan, Comey, Baker, Strzok, Clinton, any of them. So that's the unfortunate part of it. But because Sussman's such an arrogant prick, we're getting to see the whole thing, to see the deep state in operation, see a sequel to Our Man in Havana, Taylor in Panama, in live time. If you want to understand how the deep state operates, read the transcript from the Sussman trial.
Yeah. Can I just say, we did a program about the Sussman trial quite recently. And after we did it, I went away and I said to myself, right, hold on. We got a case against this person, Sussman. We're getting cases now. We got cases that implicate Fusion GPS, this company, and the Perkins Coie, the law firm. What about the FBI? What about the CIA? What about all these people in the permanent state who surely have been involved in this thing to an extraordinary degree? It seems that Durham is not going after any one of these people. Now, I have to say that does seem extraordinary. And I have to also say, I completely agree. If a lawyer, Michael Sussman and Jim Baker, apparently, according to Jim Baker, they were friends. They knew each other. If Jim Baker gets a visit from Michael Sussman. And so Michael Sussman, in the middle of a campaign, tells him, "Well, I've got all this information about Alphabet, but I'm from Perkins Coie. You know all about me, but I'm not representing anybody here." You're going to tell me that Jim Baker believes that? That Jim Baker actually believes that Sussman is acting for himself? It's just not credible. It's exactly what you said. It's clearly a device to make it easier for the FBI to launch an investigation and to pretend to the people lower down in the actual people who are doing the investigation at the coalface that this is all based upon genuine information, because it is inconceivable that Jim Baker, who knows Michael Sussman and knows who he is, and the rest of the FBI leadership weren't perfectly well aware of who was putting them up to do it. And of course, we've now also got this information that Brennan was telling Obama, well, Hillary Clinton is coming up with this Russiagate thing, and Obama knows it. Brennan at the CIA know it. And what did they do? They let it happen. Brennan comes along. He tells us that, the Russians are interfering in the election. Obama imposes all these sanctions on Russian diplomats because the Russians are interfering in the election. They, in effect, are colluding, to use the word, in what they always knew was a Hillary Clinton ploy. So it is an investigation. The Durham investigation is very narrowly focused on a small group of people within the Clinton world, but it's not looking at the permanent government of the United States, at the people who are in the FBI, in the CIA, in all the various in the Department of Justice, all of those things. And ultimately, that is terrible, because it is the CIA, the FBI, the Department of Justice that you look for to protect you from the kind of things that Hillary Clinton was doing. I mean, Hillary Clinton is, let's be straightforward about it, a devious, manipulative, corrupt politician. She is what she is, but she could only be that if she's able to find collaborators within the US's permanent state. And if all of those people are going to be able to walk away unaffected, if James Comey and Brennan and Strzok and all of those other people are able to walk away from these things, then Durham will not have done his job.
And no doubt. I mean, I think what Durham thinks his real job is a cover-up operation. Basically, Durham is building a narrative to say it wasn't the FBI or the CIA or the NSA that did anything bad. It was these evil, corrupt middlemen for the Clinton campaign that corrupted the poor FBI and confused the poor NSA and just distracted the CIA. It requires, as you note, a disregard of common sense. But that's what the narrative he's building toward is. Unfortunately. So I don't think it will go further than this. There's people that are still out there optimistic that'll go after Andrew McCabe. It's just not happening. Once Klein Smith walked, extremely low possibility. Also just reflects the history of Durham. Sadly, it shows the incapacity of our system to discipline itself. And you kind of see that also in that people think that Sussman may actually get acquitted because the DC jury pool is so bad. We have all these political cases are being tried in D.C., whether it's the January 6th cases, some Trump cases, this case. And the consequence is you're seeing a jury pool that's incapable of impartiality. And including on Sussman's trial are people whose kids play softball with people related to Sussman. You have people who donated to the Clinton campaign and participated in the Clinton campaign, part of the jury's trial. I mean, if Trump was on trial and Trump campaign organizers were on the jury, the left would be going nuts. Yet this is the norm for D.C. A fair jury in D.C. is just not completely crazy, just mostly crazy. And if it will look bad for the judicial system in D.C. if they don't convict Sussman, because those of us who have been critics that have said you can't be impartial in a political case. and are really, like, I think congressmen and senators need to seriously consider getting rid of the District of Columbia as a separate jurisdiction legally in America, because it's worse than Birmingham in the 1950s for civil rights defendants. I mean, it's just a joke. Every January 6th case is just rubber stamp verdict: guilty, 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 guilty. There's no sign of meaningful jury contemplation. They're making a joke out of the jury trial process by allowing DC juries to be even present or definitely dominant in these politically motivated cases. And so many cases related to politics have to go through DC now. So it's already a problem in different states. Like, you could have a conservative state, but you have a liberal state capital. So all your political cases go through a liberal state capital system. It's like, this is totally messed up. They need to scratch that. But, District of Columbia was never intended to be what it is now anyway. It should be scrapped as a political legal system, separated out amongst Maryland, Virginia, whatever. But it should not have its own legal system. Especially if they don't convict Sussman on again, he's dead to rights. Did he lie? Yes. Is it proven by written and oral testimony? Yes.
Yeah.
And yet even he might be acquitted. He was just a low-level actor. So I think so we'll see. Now, I'll say this: the big trial going on in America right now is a trial that makes everybody wonder what is in the water of the British judges. Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. Everybody watching that trial, it's being watched by millions on a daily basis, including a bunch of LawTube folks: Emily Baker, Nick Rekieta, Legal Bites, all these different people that are all over the place, that are getting millions of views just for broadcasting the Johnny Depp trial, Amber Heard. But everybody watching it is like, she's obviously nuts. He's obviously innocent. That's like a 95-5 opinion. And it's like, how in the world did that British judge believe Amber Heard? It's like, what does that tell you? Every Hollywood celebrity now is like, whatever you do, don't try a case in Britain. Because, people forget they removed jury trial rights.
Yeah.
I don't know if you call them rights in Britain, but it used to be defamation trials could go to a jury.
Absolutely.
Now they can't, because there was some change that happened, I guess, a few years ago. And now that judge's ruling looks maybe even as bad as the judge's ruling in the Assange case.
Yeah.
It may be worse from a factual kind of perspective. Any thoughts on how could a judge make such an embarrassing ruling that makes the British judiciary look like a very untrustworthy, unreliable? If you believed Amber Heard, you may be disqualified from being a judge moving forward.
Well, that's absolutely correct. I completely agree. It is a staggering decision, staggering to anybody who isn't aware of the kind of atmosphere that we have in Britain. To be straightforward about this, a judge in Britain who found in favor of Johnny Depp in this kind of case would be in enormously severe difficulties. There would be criticisms of him, abuse in every media newspaper. The Ministry of Justice. You remember, we used to have the Lord Chancellor's Department, which I used to have I used to work for it, in effect. I wasn't a civil servant, but I used to have connections with it. Well, that's all been abolished. We now have the Blairite Ministry of Justice. It's profoundly politicized, more so even than the Department of Justice is, I suspect, in the US. But we have a judiciary here that is very, very politicized in a way that the British judiciary was not. And without wanting to go into too many details, in Britain, this is practically a political case, because it is a man and a woman. She's saying one thing, he's saying something different. Her allegations are believed. And that's all there is to say.
It's extraordinary. The other thing that's been in a lot of legal news globally is now I don't know how it works outside of the United States, but is the attempt by the Biden administration to change the internal rules at the World Health Organization, which is meeting this week, to create a globalist power that could come in and govern even local governments in the context of a pandemic. And now in the one part of it is to change the internal health regulation rules. And often that's misportrayed, I think, in the media as legally binding. Like, at least in the United States, not legally binding at all. But I don't know about other member states, other nations. I don't know if they've passed implementing legislation that automatically delegates to the first power, but not in the U.S. And then there's talk about making that into a treaty. And in the U.S., I know British law is similar on this. Two things have to happen in the U.S. One is it has to pass 2/3 of the Senate. 2/3 of the Senate have to agree to it before it can become a treaty, and then supreme law of the land. But that's often misunderstood. In both U.S. and U.K. jurisprudence, a treaty can only govern international relations. It cannot cover domestic behaviors outside of some unique context. So, for example, tax treaties the United States signs supersedes U.S. domestic tax law as to taxation. The theory, that's where you have an interaction between a domestic action and an international action.
Yeah.
Theoretically, they're implementing an international action in the tax law context. But generally, even if a treaty passed, the legislative power can't be delegated to the Senate. The Senate can't, through a treaty, do what the Constitution requires, both bicameralism and presentment, Congress, both houses agreeing. In the case of legislation domestically, and in the case of amending the Constitution, requires more than 2/3 of the Senate, requires the states to agree as well.
Yeah.
So you can't amend the Constitution by treaty. But there's been a lot of misinterpretation. There's been a lot of misrepresentation by the media. There's a media outlet, Wikipedia, suggests that this is legally binding on the world. It's like, no, at least not America, but nor to my knowledge, UK.
No.
But it shows a greater concern that they're trying to still take the EU model and take it global and have unelected bureaucrats. The power they want to give them under the treaty is that if the World Health Organization declares there's a pandemic, that would be up to them unilaterally. There'd be no check on it. They could then have power over local economic issues as long as they said it was pandemic related. And I mean, I'm fighting with Bobby Kennedy against the Food and Drug Administration here in the United States for doing just that. They say, oh, hey, we have emergency powers. And so now all of a sudden we can mismarket a drug, mislabel a drug, mispromote a drug, call a drug a vaccine that doesn't meet the historical medical public definition of vaccine. And they're doing it all in the guise of, hey, we said emergency powers. That's magical dust. No more limitations, no more congressional limitations, no more right for anybody to sue us, no more citizen participation. That's why Bobby Kennedy and I brought suit on that. And that case is ongoing in the Western District of Texas in the division of Waco. But they're talking about it on a global scale. How much, I mean, I saw Bolsonaro talk about it, but how much have you seen any blowback through the rest of the world on what's being propounded and proposed by this globalist institution seizing power?
Right. What can I say straight away? First of all, when I first heard about this proposal, I thought this must be wrong. This must be a joke. I mean, it is inconceivable that any government would actually come forward and make this kind of proposal. That it would have this body, this international body, suddenly assume direct power, which is can somehow impose on sovereign governments. Well, the answer is that in Britain, this has been hardly discussed. I mean, hardly anybody knows about it. Outside Britain, outside, if you like, what's now called increasingly the collective West, I think the whole of the world is simply going to just either ignore it or reject it or impose it. The Russians are certainly not going to agree with it. The Chinese are certainly not going to agree with it. The Indians are certainly not going to agree with it. The commentary there in all of these places, I'm most familiar, obviously, with the Russian, has been completely negative about this whole idea. But for me, what is extraordinary about this is that this administration, I was talking about how it disregards the Constitution, it disregards due process, it disregards law, is actually proposing such an astonishing thing, so that presumably you get a president who doesn't want to take certain steps, who doesn't want to impose ideas on the states. And you have somebody, the WHO, I don't even know where they're based, actually. Is it Geneva somewhere? I have no idea where they are. They are able to then actually overrule, that's the idea as I understand it, what the president of the United States, what the governments of the states of the United States, what they do. Who is coming up with these crazy things? That is why I say this isn't just the worst administration I can remember. It is the most dangerous, because this is a proposal which, make no mistake about it, if it were ever to gain legal force, and thankfully I don't see how it can, short of amending the Constitution of the United States itself. But if it were to gain force, it would eviscerate the Constitution of the United States, and not just of the United States, but of every sovereign government country across the world.
No doubt about it. And I mean, the only other legal thing that popped up was I am increasingly disturbed by the lack of apparent POW respect for what's happening in the Russia-Ukraine on both sides. Though I understand a little bit better politically why Russia is doing what they're doing now. But like, I mean, almost no commentary in the West. Ukraine takes a Russian soldier and prosecutes him for murder for what is clearly covered by the Geneva Convention. And he was ordered by a military official during a military conflict as a military soldier to take a certain action that led to the death of another person that he said was that his person told him was necessary to protect their lives and to execute military duty. That fits within the Geneva Convention. If you think it's a war crime, it's supposed to be prosecuted later in a different context. You don't presume it and prosecute it as a domestic murder. And yet, I guess, tell you something about Ukrainian justice. It like took 2 days. They're like, he shows up, charged, guilty. So what kind of process is that?
Well, I know.
And the only commentary in the West is, evil Russian soldier convicted of war crime. Who actually wasn't convicted of war crime; he was convicted of a murder. But no commentary on what does this tell us about the Ukrainian justice system. Everything they say about the Russian justice system is what's true of the Ukrainian justice system. Complete joke, complete disaster, complete debacle, as presented in this case. And I don't think they have any excuse for not treating this individual as a prisoner of war. At least I still disagree with Russia not treating a bunch of people as prisoners of war that are out of the Donbass. But I understood better why when it was clear that many of these people, the people in the Donbass believe, many of the Azov battalion especially, committed a bunch of crimes against them over the past 8 years. And taking Russia at its word and given some social media commentary I've seen, I think it's probably accurate. When they took certain people out, they had to impose extraordinary security protocols because they believed they didn't have enough control themselves in Donbass to prevent those people from being basically publicly lynched. Because there is a lot of, what you have is a group of people who committed a lot of crimes for the better part of a decade and some horrific crimes. And so at least I understand why Russia is trying to ameliorate that by saying we'll prosecute them under domestic law. It looks like they're now going to turn them over ultimately. I guess it's going to be done on Rostov. It's going to be over there. But then there's talk that it will be on behalf of and by the Donbass political authorities. So see how all that works. But I am unsettled. I was shocked that there was almost no Western discussion of Ukraine criminally prosecuting someone and putting him in life in prison when he's clearly it's a patent violation of the Geneva Convention for the whole world to witness. New York Times, not a word. Washington Post, not a word. Wall Street Journal, not a word. British papers, not a word. Major publications in the United States, not a word. Really they kept saying Trump was eviscerating our traditions. We're witnessing real evisceration of one of the most important traditions of all, and that's the Geneva Convention after World War II. And we're witnessing its evisceration in live time often to the celebration and welcome of the West.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that. I would say they're not disregarding this story. It's not as if in Britain, at least, we are not commenting about it. On the contrary, we overwhelmingly approve of this thing. We are overwhelmingly approving of an action which has been taken, which grossly violates the Geneva Conventions. And by the way, on the subject of war crimes, virtually every newspaper I have read in Britain, virtually every article that has covered this story, wrongly say that he has been convicted of war crimes. I mean, the whole thing is appalling. It is a hideous legal charade. And by the way, I agree with you also about what the Russians are doing. Now, I don't like the Azov people at all. I think they're ghastly. I find their ideology loathsome. But they have the same rights to the protection of the law as every other human being, every other combatant in a war situation does. And you can't make these kind of exceptions. You can't bend the law in that kind of way, because if you do, then of course you get into a situation where there is in effect no law at all. And given that you especially need law in a war situation to try to preserve some kind of control of what is inherently a deeply brutalizing process, this is a very disturbing thing. Of course, those people should be treated as prisoners of war, and that Russian soldier should be treated as a prisoner of war. At least the Russians are going about it straightforwardly. You could argue that the Ukrainians also are in their own crazy way. But we in the West, The Guardian, the Financial Times, the Times, the BBC, who covered this in this fashion, the Amnesty International, all those organizations, the various barristers' chambers that get involved in these things, the fact that they not only are silent, instead of being silent, they are approving of it, is just quite simply appalling. It is so shocking that, I ask myself, is it really possible that this thing is happening in Britain today? Well, of course it is, and I'm ashamed for my country that we're engaging in this thing.
Absolutely, and it's hopefully we'll see better improvement out of it. But I think pretty much I think we will see Nuremberg 2.0. I think the Russians do plan on presenting that in that way. I think the Ukrainians would have been better off from a simple PR perspective if they would have not rushed the trial of that individual. Do a big TV show of it. Bring in all the testimony that you possibly can, whether it's most credible or not. It told me that they weren't quite as confident about aspects of that case, that they didn't want to publicly expose it to a wide range of they didn't want to see a Johnny Depp Amber Heard version, live. We'll see how it goes. But otherwise, the conflict, I think, has been the biggest loser so far in the Russia-Ukraine conflict has been the globalist visions of George Soros and his light crowd.
I agree.
Because a lot of things are not. Global digital currency ain't coming anytime soon. WHO, global control over pandemics, they can try as much as they want. Legally, politically, probably ain't coming anytime soon. And this is all because they misread Vladimir Putin and Russia, frankly, what it boils down to.
That's absolutely correct. Can I just say, apparently the Ukrainians, just coming back to that story, apparently the Ukrainians are planning to try another 47 Russian prisoners in the same way. There's going to be a whole train of these cases. So, we're only at the beginning of this. But no, fundamentally, I agree. And in fact, going back to globalization and the issue of globalization, I saw that there was a whole group of business leaders who came along to Davos, WEF and all that, World Economic Forum, never forget that's what it calls itself. Globalization in a way was conceived there back in the 60s. Anyway, a whole lot of business leaders came along. They said globalization is dead. It's just been killed. You yourselves killed it. Your sanctions, in fact, destroyed it, because what they did is they've created this new structure, these new systems. And in fact, I was reading again in the Telegraph, somebody actually saying at Davos, now, that we have all of these countries around the world, they're saying, well, if you impose sanctions like that on the Russians, you can do the same to us. So we are all now working to find alternative routes. So globalization is finished. And Vladimir Putin, he played his role, and it was a big one. But the bizarre thing about this is that the initiative to do all this thing, brought the temple down, if you like, on everybody's heads, the temple of globalization crashing down. It was done by the primary advocates of globalization themselves, because they misread the Russian economy. They weren't listening to Robert Barnes, who would have pointed out to them the Russians have oil and energy and food, so they'll be all right. They can survive a siege. They didn't listen. They went ahead. they thought that this one-dimensional economy, the size of Paraguay or whatever it is that they say, would come crashing down like a house of cards. And now they've discovered that they were completely wrong. And what's crashing down like a house of cards is the whole structure of globalization that they've spent the last 70 years creating. And as I said, it is one of the great paradoxes and ironies of history that they've done it themselves to themselves.
And just like Napoleon and the Nazis, they forgot not to poke the Russian bear.
Absolutely.
Never poke the bear.
Never poke the bear.
And now they're trying to poke the dragon.
Well, indeed,
yeah, like that. That's an improvement. These people are. I mean, I have my opposition to China's economic policies, cultural policies, social policies, etc. But the idea we should go, like you look at Trump, he never went on some tirade about even Hong Kong. He didn't do a big thing about that. He didn't do a big thing about the Uyghurs. Didn't do and while Pompeo was doing his thing, Trump himself stayed away from doing too much too provocative about either North Korea or Taiwan. Tried to cut a deal with North Korea, which was sandbagged by Sean Hannity telling him to bring John Bolton on board. But his focus was always economics. It's like, look, where you, China, are in our American opinion, hurting our American self-interest, economic self-interest, our employment, our jobs, our wages, our ability, our supply chain independence. We have a right to engage in a different sort of trade relationship with you until that gets fixed. And he tried to leverage it to say, you have some control over North Korea. Let's calm it down a little bit. That was his focus, and that's a reasonable focus. He was never talking about going to war with China over Taiwan. He was never talking about this. He was not grandstanding on issues that are internal to China. One can be critical of him, but he wasn't going to leverage American power to worry about the Uyghurs, to be frank about it. It's like Uyghurs can take care of the Uyghurs. China, that's an internal problem. You guys deal with it. Very realistic. Very directed at what mattered. Consequential, China's going to do certain things with economic policy. Then in terms of its internal currency that impacts the United States, that's relevant. If China's playing around with bioweapons, even if it's with Fauci's help and facilitation that they're doing so, that's relevant to the United States. But what's happening with the Uyghurs or the others was not going to be at the front of his agenda. That was not a realpolitik focal point of what was in America's interest. This is nuts, trying to provoke a conflict over Taiwan. Now, I see both sides. Like some of the anti-war left crowd pretends Taiwan really wants to be part of China. I saw some of these tweets and comments the other day. It's like, no, the Independence Party hasn't won by double digits in back-to-back elections because all of Taiwan wants to join China. That's just not the case. That doesn't mean they want confrontation either. And it sounds like, it's like we're trying to provoke. I think the only way China goes into Taiwan, given the problems, if they want to go into Taiwan the way Russia did Ukraine, militarily, that'd be a very difficult thing to achieve. You're talking about 24 million people, an island surrounded by water. You got mountains. You got an urbanly dense community. That's not an easy battle to win militarily if you don't want to cause any collateral damage. So for all the people saying, "Oh, China would kill them in 5 seconds," I don't know if I'd go there. Not if they're not willing to use certain tactical advantages. But I don't think they do go in when they believe that over time they can build their one country, two systems strategy that time, because Taiwan has shown in the late 90s, in the mid 2000s, all the way up to 2014, some portion of their public, about 45%, empathetic with that agenda, even though it's the older part of the Taiwanese generation. Why go in? I think they only go in if they really feel provoked to. The U.S. landed weapons right on Taiwan. Now we've got the Japanese gave us some military islands, not just a little bit north of Taiwan, and I understand Taiwan's historic geopolitical significance to the whole South Asia seas, but it doesn't make sense that we would provoke an actual military conflict. That would be insane. Now I'm not as confident as either side about how that would work. It's amazing. It's like people that are pro-Russia, Russia would whip Europe, Russia would whip America, Russia would whip everybody. It's like, I don't think Putin thinks that. Or vice versa, that the EU, the NATO would wipe Russia off the map. Most simulations show a tie. And that's if you pretend nuclear weapons won't be used, of course, in the process. But in China, similarly, the military hasn't been tested in a long time. Some doubts about how effective it's big scale and size, big budget. How does that translate? Don't know. But I don't want to find out, for one.
Well, exactly. I think this is exactly right. I don't think the Chinese left to themselves, if the situation had been left alone, would be looking at this moment in time to start a war over Taiwan. It is hardly a priority. I mean, the Chinese have lots of other problems. I mean, we tend to forget this, but they're a huge country, lots of problems, all kinds
their
of
zero COVID policy is
well,
shrinking their
exactly.
supply chains and
Well,
beating their
exactly.
economy up.
Well, exactly. So, I mean, the last thing they would want at this moment in time is a major war, which is going to disrupt their economy more and create ever more problems. And can I just say, I think the same was true of Russia with Ukraine. I mean, I don't get the impression that Vladimir Putin was straining at the leash to unleash the Russian army on Ukraine. Absolutely not. If he'd got what he was asking for, which was not unreasonable or excessive. Ukraine doesn't join NATO. What's the problem? What really is the problem with that?
Just honor the Minsk Accords that you had agreed to for 8 years.
Exactly. We wouldn't have been in this situation. And the same is true with Taiwan. I don't think the Chinese want a war over Taiwan. But it seems as if there are some people in Washington that are almost doing everything they can to goad them into doing it. And very dangerously, the president of the United States, either because he's, senile, or because he's a fool, or because he agrees with this policy, seems to be going along with it with these extraordinary statements that he's blurting out. Now, a war with Taiwan, between China and Taiwan, it may not be a good thing for China. It would be a disaster for Taiwan. I can't see how it turns out well in the end for the United States or the world. I mean, if we're going to impose sanctions on China, well, what Donald Trump wanted to do, he wanted to impose tariffs. He wanted to have an industrial policy. People always forget this. He was never able to do it. He never had the time or the political space to get it organized because, well, we all know the reasons. But if you want to reduce your dependence on China and importing of manufacturing goods, by all means, do it. Build up your factories. Organize your own domestic supply chains. Do America first. Remember that? That was the slogan. Do America first. Do it. But at the moment, you haven't done it. You're in fact doing the opposite. All the talk is that you're going to lower tariffs on Chinese goods in order to try to deal with the massive inflation that you've created. So, create a war with China now. Impose sanctions on China now. Interrupt those supply chains when your factories in the United States aren't geared up and ready to replace Chinese goods. Do you really want to do that? Do you really want to push up inflation from 10% to 20%, 30%, 40%? I can remember in Britain in the 70s when it got up as high as 27%. I mean, it can happen. And, that's a developed economy too. But is that the road we're going down? Well, it seems some people in Washington almost are willing us there. And so bad for China, disastrous for Taiwan, not good for the United States or for the American people at all. And China will come through, just as Russia it will, be very disruptive. Their political system will bear it. I've been there. I saw how strong the surveillance mechanisms, the control mechanisms in China are. I think they can handle any problems. I think they still have a very large critical mass of support within their country. And of course, if there's a war over Taiwan, which is seen as having been provoked by the United States, Chinese nationalism will kick in, and nobody should be surprised about that. They'll come through. But whatever tattered remnants of globalization still exist will, of course, all have gone. And in the meantime, the United States will be forced into pursuing that reconstruction of its economy, which perhaps it needs, but in very, very difficult economic conditions, conditions of high inflation, of great economic imbalance and all of this. So, as I say, this is a very dangerous administration.
No doubt. I think what we'll find is that maybe Biden will come out with the second part of Build Back Better. He's got a great idea. He's going to call it the Great Leap Forward.
That's brilliant. I love that. Yeah, the Great Leap Forward. Yes.
Fantastic. Wrap it up, guys.
Why
Absolutely.
not? Yes. Yeah.
I think we covered a ton of ground. You guys covered a lot of topics. Let's wrap it up there. Robert, where can people find you once again?
They can find all the content and create their own at vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
Fantastic. Thank you, the great Robert Barnes. Thank you, Alexander Mercuries. Guys, all the super chats, all the questions from the locals chat, super chats, Rumble, Odyssey, we will answer them in a dedicated show. And what else? Thank you to our moderators, Zariel, Alan Watson, Reckless Abandon. I think those were the 3 moderators we had today. Thank you very much for helping us out in the chat, to our great moderators. And thank you to everyone that watched us on Odyssey, on Rumble, on our locals chat, and on YouTube. Thank you once again, Robert. It was a fantastic show. Always great to have Robert with us. And thank you, Alexander. Any final comments before we wrap it up and say goodnight to everybody? Or good morning?
Well, we ended with China. So you remember, we have the famous Chinese thing about, may you live in interesting times. Or, well, we certainly do live in very, very interesting times. And, we will be following everything. And we are very, very grateful for Robert for providing us all this enormous insight about what's going on in the United States. Remember, in spite of everything, the growth of Chinese power, the things that the Russians do, it's still the United States where the big decisions, the really pivotal decisions are made. And we have to always hope that ultimately the reason will prevail there, and we won't see ever more bizarre and dangerous decisions made in the United States, because whatever happens in Washington, whatever happens in the United States, it resonates globally. And it's so great that Robert can help us through this complex maze that American politics is. Very different from politics anywhere in Europe, by the way.
And hopefully we return to our roots of not going abroad searching for monsters to destroy, as John Quincy Adams warned, lest we become the monster ourselves. And hopefully that the interesting times proverb will be more promising than a curse as we live through these interesting times indeed.
All right. We will leave it there. Take care, everybody.